Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. November is upon us. I apologize for not getting a show out last weekend, first part of November. I was traveling quite a bit and just time did not work out. Time and topics did not work out. But good to be back with everybody. Another weekend perspective. For a lot of folks, especially the folks in the United States, the U.S. election has sort of dominated the headlines over the last week or so. And while we, try very, very hard on this show not to talk about politics, as we try and keep the show, somewhat regionally, I don't want to say unbiased, but we try and realize that at least half of our audience is not in the United States. The reality is the U.S. election does have consequences and impacts and influence over the rest of the world. We are not going to talk about the U.S. election specifically on this show, although I did put a number of links in the show notes to 3 or 4 shows that I thought did a pretty good job of kind of looking at what are the potential from a tech perspective of the new administration taking over in January and what the next 2 years or 4 years could look like. I thought they did a good job of that. Again, there's links to those in the show notes. What I did try and do for myself in particular was, because somewhat of my job, and we use this podcast somewhat as an experimentation for things that we do in our day job, is to take a look at, for both the winning side and the losing side, as they were communicating their messages, as they were trying to rally support, as they were trying to introduce new ideas, into the electorate. What were some of those things that the concepts, not necessarily, specifics about taxation or, whatever else, the issue of the day might have been, but what were the things that they did from a communication perspective that I could take away as being useful in terms of, identifying, how to identify audiences, identify segmentation within audiences, how to look at introducing new ideas versus trying to maintain or establish current ideas. And so I spent the last week or so kind of thinking about what were the things that I could learn from these, from these campaigns, again, from a non-political perspective, but just conceptual perspective, that could be useful if your job has to do with, messaging, communication, trying to introduce new ideas, trying to dispute, things about what you're talking about. And I feel like this could be useful whether you are, in the product and technology space, or whether you are trying to, convey ideas within your job. So what I want to try and do today is dive into a number of things. I think I've got a list of about 10 or 12 things that I learned and I am experimenting with and exploring in terms of, how this race was communicated, the communication across the campaigns, how people took those things and how those could be applied to the tech space. So I'm going to dig into that right after the break.
AI may be the most important new computer technology ever, but AI needs a lot of processing speed, and that gets expensive fast. Upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is the single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. Do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic. Take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/cloudcast. oracle.com/cloudcast.
Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to take a look at the thing that has sort of dominated the conversation outside of cloud computing and AI for the last year or so, 2 years or so, kind of what feels like an ongoing thing, but at least over the last year or so. And that was the elections in the United States. And again, I'm not going to get into the politics of it. I'm not going to get into, one side versus another. But what I do want to do is, because this is such a huge activity in terms of communication, the idea of how do I introduce individuals, how do I try and position, people or ideas, how do I position new ideas, how do I try and spin old ideas, how do we try and segment market spaces, all those types of things that have to do with communications as a whole, right? And could be applied to, things that are new ideas you're trying to introduce, right? Like, so if I think about this, this doesn't feel as much of a stretch to say, hey, that's the kind of things that go on at KubeCon, at reInvent, at any vendor conference, at any new idea that's introduced into the marketplace, whether it's DevOps or platform engineering or any of those things. So what I've been trying to do this past week, and I mentioned this top of the hour or top of the show, is what are the things that looking at what was successful in this campaign versus what was unsuccessful in this campaign, what sort of lessons could be taken away or potentially applied that could be relevant in the things that you do on a day-to-day basis. So I made a list. I've got 13 of them. I don't know that I'll get to all of them. I know none of you probably want to listen to me ramble through that many of them, but I'm going to try and kind of lump them together, and I'm going to try and apply them to things that I've both seen over the last couple of years in terms from a technology perspective, what's worked, what hasn't worked, but also what might be relevant kind of going forward. So here's the list. So first thing on the list I have is it is very difficult to disrupt an incumbent or the most well-known name. And what I highlight here is, oftentimes we will say, well, it's very difficult to disrupt the incumbent because the incumbent, has sort of everything going in their direction. You've got people that are comfortable with them, they're familiar with them, they can have used experiences, shared experiences with the incumbent. They can recognize what the current thing looks like. Now, the challenge in this specific instance was you had a situation in which the role of the incumbent in this election was sort of skewed because one party changed their candidate sort of late in the process. So that would have been the incumbent. On the other side, you have a name that is been around for more than a decade, more than 2 decades. And so it was almost like the well-known name was actually more well-known than the incumbent. But the reason I highlight this one in particular is if you are trying to introduce something new, you are always going to be compared, probably more so than you're going to be compared against the incumbent, against the thing that is well-known, more so than you're going to get to define yourself. And so it's kind of an exercise in how well can you define yourself, knowing that a good percentage of how you're going to be defined is going to be compared or, previously shaped in the minds of people by something else, by either, kind of the thing that came before you or the most well-known name. And I think that was extremely visible and prevalent in this last one. And I think it's visible and prevalent whenever we think about startups and new companies and new technologies kind of getting into the market. The second thing I had on my list is it's very difficult to prove what if. It's very difficult to model out the future versus something that's already happened, right? And what I mean by that is oftentimes in elections, but also in technology, we're trying to convey the idea that this new thing, if you think about what it can be in the future, will be better, faster, cheaper, more influential, more effective in your life. That is a very hard thing to do. And I think this last election was very much a contrast between, what's possible in the future versus what's possible, both in a positive and a negative sense. And I think for a lot of people, that's a hard thing to get across because they haven't lived it. And when you compare that against something that people have lived with or results that people can see and identify with, and whether they like them or not, you realize that if your argument, if your positioning is entirely what could happen in the future versus what somebody has experienced, those are very difficult things to do because you're putting a person into a position that they haven't experienced those emotions yet. They haven't experienced the ramifications of what that future could mean. And I know that we see this. We saw this in the election somewhat, but we see this. We're just talking about things like, what would AI do to your business? How could that impact your personal life? How could that impact your business? What could you experience? Could you see yourself using VR goggles or something? And it's sort of hard to deal with something. It's harder to deal with something like that than there is something that people have tangibly experienced. And so you have to really think about, what leap are you asking the person on the other end of your message to sort of take with you if you're talking about a what if, a future scenario. Third thing I had on my list is it's really important to figure out, are you trying to change the story or are you trying to stick to the story? And I have this sort of listed as, you want to know about your messaging velocity and your messaging variability, right? And I think in this past case, if we think about it, we had one candidate who was very, very disciplined about their message. They had 4 or 5 talking points. They hit those talking points. They were very consistent about them sort of over and over again. And you had another candidate who on a daily basis, in some cases an hourly basis, in some cases good, in some cases bad, was changing their message all the time. And to a certain extent, you could say, well, that's lack of discipline. But at the same time, we would also, in the tech industry, sort of characterize that as like, oh, you are failing fast. You are getting new iterations out there. You're sort of seeing, sort of the MVP type of structure of that. And I think to a certain extent, if you are, depending on the situation, if you're not exactly sure what you're trying to say, or if you are trying to reach a large number of people that have a diverse set of needs, like one or the two of those approaches might work better than others, right? And I'm not trying to call out sort of like what's better versus worse, but I think there is some capabilities in there, some knowledge in there about saying, who am I trying to reach? Am I trying to spend all my time on 3 or 4 points in which I want to stay really, focused and disciplined about, or am I trying to reach, kind of a broad set of audiences that don't necessarily all have the same needs? And I want to get out there and see what will work with them, right? What things resonate with them? What things will be perceived to be valuable? What things will be perceived to be useful to them? And again, I think this is where, you get into am I going to throw a lot of things out there? Because again, this is where, politics and technology are similar and they also change somewhat. We tend to say that, if you did that in technology, if you were constantly making changes to something and you were able to iterate on it quickly and you're able to throw things out there and see if they work, and if they don't work, you sort of take them back or whatever, that's successful. I mean, that's your deploy 10 times a day sort of approach to things, versus, the old, the way of, doing the same thing over and over again and never really changing is sort of static. You're not going to keep up with business. Again, I think it depends on the audience you're trying to reach. What's the message you have? What's the diversity of your audience? But I thought that was a huge part of what went on in this last cycle. Fourth thing I had on my list is whether they are, and this is something I've learned over time, is I think people in general, when you're talking about a large number of people, whether you are leading a company, leading a group, or you're trying to take on a large political office or whatever, the people that are going to pay attention to what you're saying, in many cases, and I know this is going to sound weird and sort of contradictory, because I think a lot of people feel like, well, I control my own destiny. I know where I want things to go. But I think when you kind of get into groups and you're part of a group, whether that's a group at work trying to achieve a goal, or whether you're part of a company and you're hoping the company does well or whatever, you have a tendency to want to believe in the leader, the person that's leading the group, right? And I think what we saw in this sort of last cycle was, and this is one of these things where it was like it wasn't necessarily always clear, but if you lay out a plan, if you have a distinct plan for where you want to go, you can reiterate that plan, and it is something that people can kind of go, okay, I see what the plan is, I know where the plan is going, versus sort of having chunks of a plan, or in some cases like, well, we've got some things, we're going to do some stuff, but they don't feel coherent, they don't feel connected together. That can often give people the idea that, like, even though you're trying to put it together, even though you don't really want to say, well, look, this is really complicated, we're going to work it out as we go, we're going to hire smart people, all those sort of things. The idea of having a plan, even if it's a bad plan or an ill-conceived plan, versus having sort of bits and chunks of stuff, does convey the idea that you just kind of don't fully grasp what you're getting into. And again, I don't know, I'm not trying to make a commentary on on this last one. I think there was examples of, places where there were complete plans in place, and other cases there weren't complete plans in place on both sides. And so I'm not sort of calling out one versus the other, but I think there were points in time when having a plan or stating that you had a plan and people understanding what that was, and again, whether it was deemed to be good or bad or whatever, is more valuable, because people are looking for a leader who conveys the idea that they're going to lead, not that they're figuring out how to lead. And I think that's really important. The sixth thing I had on my list is, we see this more in politics, but we also see it in technology, right? Fear is oftentimes as powerful a motivator as, kind of the opposite, right? Hope and joy and possibilities. And so we have a tendency sometimes in technology to sort of want to talk about the possibilities of the future. But we've also seen that, there are plenty of times when people make decisions based on out of fear. They're concerned about their job, they're concerned about their career, they're concerned about, will this break and be blamed on me, right? I mean, there's a whole reason why we joke all the time about blameless postmortems, because we know that that's not really a reality in most cases. And so, understand that, fear or speaking to people's fears, not necessarily conveying fear or being negative, but speaking to people's fears is oftentimes as powerful or as impactful as speaking to that thing I talked about at the beginning, sort of possibilities in the future and joy and happiness and all those sort of things. And so, I think you got to find with a specific audience what motivates them. What, are they more motivated by excitement about newness and possibilities and what ifs and the unknown, or are they more, driven and motivated by, sort of fears and concerns about if things don't go well, what is my role? What's my career? Am I going to lose money? Am I going to make money? Am I going to be in a better position than I was before? And I think we don't always recognize that both of those things are incredibly powerful emotional things that really are make big parts of the decision process, as much as in some cases more than some of the technical details or, capabilities. Could something do this or could it do that? Next thing I had on my list, I'm up to 6 for those of you keeping track. And I thought this one was really important. Complex topics are difficult for people to understand especially if they're not well defined. And I think, and I'll use this as an example, and again, this isn't trying to get political. There was a lot of discussion in this past election about democracy, and was this a referendum on democracy? And while it was talked about a lot, I don't recall it ever kind of being defined for people. And I think when you've got a set of people who are making a big topic like something like that the center of the argument, and then never really defining it, and then telling people, this thing will go away or this thing will get better or whatever, you run the risk that lots of people are like, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't understand it, or I don't know why you're making that argument, because that doesn't seem like a thing. And the analogy that I'll make to this is, we've talked for 10 plus years about DevOps, and we've been talking for the last 3 or 4 years about platform engineering. And I would make a similar argument that while there are lots of people who sort of nod their head and go, yeah, we need that, look, gosh, there's DevOps days and there's, all these sort of things. If we're realistic with ourselves, those two topics don't have a very clear, concise definition. It's sort of a, well, you know it when you see it, or the cool kids know what that is. I can't believe you don't know what that is. And then, we wonder why something hasn't been heavily adopted, or we wonder why, there are so many people who are like, yeah, we do DevOps. Sure. I mean, we can ship more than once in a year or twice in a year or something. And you're like, no, that's not DevOps. You don't seem to understand it. So I think, this last, election for me was one of those things where there was a couple of really big topics that were front and center of the discussion. They were never, at least by one side, identified and defined, even though maybe we should have learned about them when we were in elementary school and middle school and, at a younger age. But they were the center of the discussion. They were never sort of the definition of what it is and what it means wasn't kind of established and defined. And because of that, you had a lot of, well, I mean, I think we kind of do that. Like, are you sure? I don't really understand why you think that's such a big deal. And I think to me, the parallel to that is sort of where we've been with DevOps for the last 10 plus years, in which people are sort of like, well, you don't do DevOps right, or you can't buy DevOps, or no, you're not really doing DevOps. And you're sort of like, all right, well, define DevOps for me. And they're like, well, it's a technology thing. No, it's not really a technology thing. It's a process thing. It's a human thing. It's a this, it's a that. And so anyways, I think it's very difficult to have complex topics for people to understand when they're not well defined and the definition kind of floats around and it's sort of, anyways. Seventh thing I had on my list, and these will get going faster as I get going through these. End of the day, people tend to make decisions with their wallet. As much as there can be a million different discussion points, that you're talking about. At the end of the day, when it comes time to make a decision, so many of those items that may have been up for discussion, that may have been up for debate, oftentimes get put in the back burner when you get basically down to a purely economic discussion of, can I afford this? Can I not afford this? Does it feel like it's more expensive to me? Does it feel like it's valuable to me? Do I feel like it's outside of my reach? So I think it's important as you're communicating anything about technology to always remember in your back of your mind, if you don't have a strong economic piece of what you're trying to talk about somewhere readily available that people understand, and maybe it's at the beginning, maybe it's at the end, that will always sort of come back at the end and be really central to this discussion. And I can't remember how many times I've talked to people and they were excited about something or whatever they were, and at the end of the day they were like, but how much does it cost? Could I do this cheaper? Does the cost of making this change is it really worth it? I think we oftentimes forget and we get emotional about lots of other things. At the end of the day, in many, many cases, people will vote with their wallet, and they'll vote with their wallet at the end of the process. And if you haven't established what that should look like well enough, again, in a technical discussion or political discussion, it will oftentimes come back to you in ways that you hadn't expected it. Okay, next thing, number 8. And I think this is really important. Again, this is sort of, fits technology, sort of fits politics as well. Is the argument that you're making speaking to a niche audience or a really large audience? And again, this is where you kind of get into audience segmentation. If you are, for example, trying to talk about something that is security specific, security might be a topic that is only relevant, in reality to a few number of people, the people that truly have to deal with security. And even though we make, these statements once a year and we do our compliance training of like, security is everybody's job, the reality is most people don't think about it. They're not really worried about it. If they think there's a lock somewhere or a password somewhere, they think they've done security. And the reason I highlight this is if your thing is, I'm trying to convey a security message, it's fine to sort of, have a niche perspective and a niche focus on that audience. If you're trying to convey something that's bigger than that, right? You're trying to convey the idea of like, everything is connected, or what happens if, what would be the ramifications of everybody having a mobile phone? Then you're going to have a much broader sort of message or subset of messages, because the person who, cares about a mobile phone might care about gaming. They might care about, building a mobile application. They might think about, how does mobile impact my ability to do my day-to-day job, right? Like 4 or 5, 10, 20 different, concerns and things and subsegments and niches of the audience. So again, it's important to understand, are you speaking to a niche audience or are you speaking to a broader audience, and making sure that your message is relevant to that specific thing. Okay. I'm going to kind of go through the rest of these. We're, about 20 minutes in. We're going to try and wrap this up fairly quickly. Number 9, if your competition defines you, right? And this is sort of a worst case scenario. If your competition defines you, you need to work very quickly to reframe that so that you define yourself, right? And by that, I mean, you want to set the definition of who you are, what you're trying to convey, what value you bring, what topics are important to you and that you want to connect with the audience on. And if your competition is defining who you are. The language that they're using defines who you are, or they put you in a little box and you want to be portrayed in a bigger box, right? In a bigger lens. You have to work really, really hard until you have reestablished what the definition of you is. And I thought there were a ton of situations in which, in this last cycle, in which one side or the other tried to define the other one, and there were examples in which the opposite side, in some cases, did a great job of not letting the competitor's definition define them, and in some cases, the competitor's definition defined them far, far more than it should have. And so, again, the walk away from this is, if you are competing against somebody, you need to be adamant about defining yourself and then continuing to define yourself, especially if you get into a situation in which your competitor has made some headway in defining you in a way that you don't want to be defined. Okay. Next thing I have on my list is sort of goes along the same way in terms of competition. If your competitor finds a liability in you, a flaw in you, a weakness in what you deliver, you need to address it extremely quickly, right? If you allow a competitor to define your weakness and to highlight it, it could be the smallest thing possible. I mean, it could be a 1% of everything you do, a 2% of everything you do, but they define you, or they identify that, and they continue to harp on it, and you don't come back and deal with it. You're essentially saying to the marketplace, yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're right. But that's not important to me, so I'm not going to worry about it. But what you have to realize is, if that is something that your competitor continues to harp on, they're probably doing it because they're getting some sort of feedback mechanism that's telling them, this is resonating. This is even though it might only seem like a small percentage, it is resonating, and it is resonating with people in a way that they're being turned away from your competition. Your competition is the audience is turning away from your competition because of something very, very small. And this is one of those things that, if you're mapping this whole thing out and you said, hey, what are our biggest strengths and what are our weaknesses? And this was something in your weakness category, you might just be like, well, I can offset that with a lot of great strengths. But this is something that, if they are continuing to harp on it, you need to recognize that the reason they're harping on it, they're spending money on it, they're spending their time on it, is they are getting some feedback mechanism that it is resonating. And if you don't address it, it will become not just a tiny weakness, but very likely the perception of a very, very large weakness of you or your product or your technology or whatever you're doing. So very, really, really, really important. And again, number 11 kind of goes to the same thing. Small things can become the center of discussion, right? And, in political campaigns, we see this all the time. This is where, something pops up and it's the discussion for a week and then it kind of goes away. But this is the same thing in technology, right? I've seen many, many scenarios in which, something about something becomes the center of discussion. And this is where we see companies figure out if they're willing to respond to something. So for example, just using a technology discussion, like when the first iPhone came out, it didn't support cut and paste. And so, the BlackBerries of the world, the Microsofts of the world, people that were competing with it, the Nokias of the world, were like, hey, this is a business device. Cut and paste is just absolutely must-have feature. And you could be sitting there thinking, well, gosh, like it does all these other amazing things. It gives me full internet. It's got music built in. It's got video built in. It's got this wide screen and touch screen. But if you allow something really little like that to become problematic, as we saw at the beginning of the iPhone launch, eventually they had to go and fix that and put that functionality in, cut and paste, which none of us think about anymore. But it's one of those things where you realize as a company, like, you're either going to stand on principles and say, hey, that's not the way that we do things. Cut and paste is not the future forward of how you should deal with a device. Or you say, you know what, I'm in the business of solving problems for my customers, and I'm going to address that. And though it might cause me some hiccups or bumps in the road, and we might have to do things slightly different than we had intended to do, that's something that is really important to them. And it seemed really small to them, but it's really important to them. We need to try and address that. And that conveys the idea to your customers that you are listening, and that, the things that are important to them, the problems that are important to them, are going to be things that you want to provide a solution to and you want to provide value around. So again, you want to do well in the things that you think you do well in, But you do have to remember that sometimes really little things can become the center of discussion. And then you have to decide, how are we going to address that? Do we ignore it? Do we address it? Do we acknowledge it and say, hey, we were wrong about that, or we didn't recognize that was important, right? The way that you interact with sometimes the littlest things sometimes can convey really big things to your audience. All right, 2 left. The first one is know where your audience is getting their information from. And what I mean by that is, I think we saw in this last election, so much was made of the last month or so of how podcasts came into play, right? Podcasts are, for many of us now, are perceived to be sort of a mainstream media thing, but in reality, they're very niche-y, especially compared to the largest, broadband channels and other types of things. But we realize that while it can be niche-y, and some people may listen to some podcasts or 20 podcasts, and some podcasts might have 1,000 listeners and others have 1 million listeners, not recognizing, you're not understanding the channels in which your constituents get their information from can be a big gap. And so it's really important to understand, where do they get their information from, and are you present in those places? Even if it feels unusual or uncomfortable or unconventional, and again, this goes back to your audience niche, understanding your audience, all those sort of things. But I think this was a very good example of, are we in the places, are we getting our message out there? Do we speak appropriately in the different information channels in which our audience feels comfortable? Not that you feel comfortable, that they feel comfortable getting their information. And do you understand how the conversation is happening in those channels? So, and the last thing I've got is, and this is, kind of conveyed, at least in the U.S. elections, is we often have, actually sort of what we call midterm elections every 2 years versus the main election every 4 years. In the midterm elections, we tend to communicate specific issues, right? Like, issues tend to drive people to participate and vote and so forth. Like, do we make this law? Do we not make this law? Do we introduce this new bill or tax on something? Do we not introduce it? It's less oftentimes about the candidates, the people themselves, but it's about the issues specifically. In the main elections, the 4-year elections, it's very much about the people. Oftentimes, it's people, the candidates themselves, oftentimes more so than the specific issues, because the candidates are going to be representative of many, many issues. And this is, I think the analogy to this is, are you trying to get people to align to an issue with your technology, with your message and so forth, right? Like, you should all be doing the DevOps. Or are you trying to convey people to the idea of, we want you to be aligned to something that that addresses multiple issues. So maybe you are, selling something, conveying something that is more of a platform, right, than a specific, solves a specific problem versus solves potentially many, many problems with the same, concept or something. So I think that's very, very important to understand is, are you in a situation in which the thing that's important to people solves many problems or could solve many problems or be involved with many problems? Or are you trying to have a discussion around something that is specific to a specific problem, a specific task, a specific concern, decision point, whatever that might be? So anyways, with that, I went through 13 things. I know I've gone for a while. If you're still listening, I hope this has been somewhat helpful to you. But I've been trying to do a lot of thinking outside of purely the politics of the last week and say, okay, are there things that I can learn from, a situation over the last year plus in which people have spent billions and billions of dollars to try and, do what they try and do in politics? Is there something in that I can convey or can learn that would help my day-to-day job, as opposed to, my position or cares about politics and all those sort of things? So hopefully some of this was helpful to you. I apologize, and it wasn't my intention to downplay the politics of it. I know people have very strong emotions on both sides of this. Like I said, there are plenty of other podcasts that get into that. I wasn't trying to convey that. I wasn't trying to downplay it here. I was just trying to find an angle that was relevant to what we talk about on this podcast. So with that, I'll wrap it up. And thank you all for listening. Thank you all for putting up with me missing last week. I appreciate the flexibility of not giving us all kinds of grief for missing one out of 50 weeks. There are 52 weeks that we do it for the year. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. And with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.